This patch is all buffs, which is a really interesting decision considering just how many powerful cards there are running around right now, but it does sort of seem like those powerful cards are in equilibrium, so let's get into it. First up, Sabah Nur and his backside Apocalypse Celestials Chosen, gaining a point of power each, 4-6 here, 4-9 on the backside, meaning that this is now a card that actually has much more respectable stats. Apocalypse Celestials Chosen, the flipped side of this, serving as bigger Lockjaw, definitely didn't feel like it was a big part of the metagame, but there are things that can make this card a little bit more interesting. Unfortunately, I'm not sure that this change is one of them. This is a fine change that I have no objection to. It's a free change for them to pick up off the ground, but it is only picking up free change off the ground, which is to say this is not a seismic shift. It's just like a pretty reasonable and notable thing that it's good for them to do, but it's not going to fundamentally change what this card's problems are. This card's problems are mostly outside of its own stat line, so short of giving it something really busted to do, largely what you notice when you play this card is that the output is pretty indeterminate. It might not even really be an upgrade unless you're flipping away something like the Void or a Hood, and that there are other things that are probably better to do with those cards, like Merlin transforming the Void is probably better than what this guy is offering, and playing Misery on the Hood is probably better than what this guy is offering, so he's not even really the best at doing that. He's a pretty okay card, and he got pretty okayer, but largely in a metagame that seems pretty focused on either, alternately, let's take a look at the pillars of the metagame right now. There is the newly released Gambit, which is blowing up the things that this guy is going to flip. There is Shou Lao, which is going over the top of whatever this guy is going to be doing. And there is Star-Lord, which is also going over the top of whatever this guy is going to be doing. So he just sort of ends up in a space that is very medium, not in the sense of his own power, but in the sense that all the decks he goes in are probably not the best things to do with the targets that he has. You'd rather Annihilus the Void, you'd rather do a bunch of stuff to the cards that you're looking to target with him, and he's just like a pretty okay body that you're generally happy with, but we're not in a metagame where you play things that are pretty okay bodies that you're generally happy with. 3-8 is a genuinely pretty compelling stat line when that 3-8 hooks into other synergy pieces. Debrii going to 3-8 in advance of the upcoming Sandstorm and Ozymandias. In a world where people are actually playing the rock deck, Debrii with an Ozymandias is going to be 14 power. Again, we talked about this in the context of Apocalypse Celestials Chosen, who Debrii is also a card that you see occasionally with, where it's just like, I got my 3-8, I got my Apocalypse, now that's a 4-9, I'm flipping one of those rocks into something else. Honestly, the biggest problem with that is that you sometimes don't know exactly where the rocks are coming from or which rock is going to flip. That's kind of the awkward bit. I've seen some pretty cool stuff with like Storm Apocalypse that's been like at least nominally compelling. Apocalypse himself alongside Debrii has gone into like some Wiccan decks that have been, again, nominally compelling, like the Darkhawk stuff. I've seen a Storm Apocalypse Wiccan deck that's like pretty compelling as well. It seems like in a real world, this is the kind of card, this kind of package, right? Storm and Debrii and Apocalypse, like these are the kind of cards that can go into a mid-rangey deck. We're just not in a metagame that is pretty conducive to that right now. What Debrii is also doing, though, is just being quite large. Like 3-8 is nothing to scoff at. This is definitely the kind of change that maybe right now isn't going to matter, but this is a staple in whatever deck Ozymandias ends up going in. Absolute 100% staple. And I would imagine that this card getting better is actually pretty meaningful to that deck, because one of the things a deck like that is often going to struggle with is, am I getting enough points in individual lanes? Those decks tend to be pretty good at spreading power across the board, a lot of small stuff that's getting bonuses, but much like V-Hand, there's a lot of like, okay, am I actually getting enough points in individual lanes, or is my opponent just going to be able to hard target 2 lanes, go above what I'm doing? That would be the biggest risk here, and so Debrii getting an extra point of power is going to be, I suspect, a pretty meaningful buff to the future Ozymandias list. I can also see this being pretty meaningful if people are trying to mess around with Sabah Nur right now, just because a 3-8 with potential upside is actually pretty good. Like, the more points this kind of package of mid-range stuff gets, the more compelling it becomes, even though mid-range is in a relatively disadvantageous position in the metagame right now. The Tiger Spirit of White Tiger is going to 10 power, which is compelling in a vague sense, which is to say, like, I'm going to Wong my White Tiger and play Scar, but probably not going to do all that much with it. That said, I mean, I do think that, like, the Wong deck is almost a little bit unfairly maligned at this point in Marvel Snap's history. Like, Yes, it is very telegraphed and straightforward, but a lot of things are pretty telegraphed and straightforward. And the more points you're getting from this stuff, the more beneficial it's going to be to do that. I do think that like this is a fun little break point to hit. I like that it's going to 10. I think that's a good thing for it to do. I don't think it's necessarily changing too much about what White Tiger is, but it does sort of make you consider like, okay, am I going to be like a White Tiger Cersei, White Tiger Polymorph? I think a lot of what holds that stuff back is the sixes that you can make are actually quite bad. Anyone who's played a lot with like Cersei's and Polymorphs has noticed that like I think there's like a pretty big break point right around 4 where you're like, all right, that's about what I want out of my investment here for like consistent stats. Whereas like 6s, the range is very large. Like you would get anything from a Zola or a Null to a Destroyer or an Infinite. And the range being so large makes it a little harder to actually make those plays because it feels like there's just more things that screw you over when you get into the top. And so you end up with like a bit of a more interesting dilemma than you would otherwise have. Like, I think if the 6 pool was a little bit better, I would be much more interested in doing like Merlin stuff and Cersei stuff with this. But the 6 pool is such a crapshoot that I kind of just am not. That said, I mean, I do think that this is likely not to have a major impact on the metagame, but there is a sort of point at which where you got to take a look and be like, all right, well, this deck does have a lot more points than it otherwise did, and maybe I can combo off people out of that. Like, who knows? I don't expect it to be a particularly good deck, but I do think that like this is a pretty meaningful buff for people in lower elos where it's like, all right, you know, I can just Wong people now. Ghost, arguably Marvel Snap's least effective rework. This is a fairly reasonable buff for it to have, and by which I mean I think it probably should have had this like 2 or 3 months ago. Ghost, of course, is the anti-end of turn tech card. It removes the abilities from end of turn cards with an on reveal. 3/5 is obviously something it should have. I also want to talk about what would make this card actually functional at its job, though, because right now, the biggest problem Ghost has is that it's not very good at its own job, and if you want to remove the end of turn abilities from cards, the actual best thing to do is play a Supergiant. Like, that'll remove the end of turn abilities because they'll reveal at the end of the game. That's a much better tech card against this specific stuff than Ghost is, and that really holds her back. But even Ghost could be a better tech card if she just said ongoing. Like, she just doesn't say ongoing, and so if the deck that is playing a bunch of Invisible Womans and cards with 3 power is able to throw priority, and spoiler alert, it is, then they're just going to play an Iska and a guy that like gets +3 power for every proc of Invisible Woman Jocasta it gets, right? And so you're not actually going to be able to use this Ghost on them. So Ghost is a card that fails not by virtue of it being a 3/4 or a 3/5 or anything like that. It fails because it doesn't do its own job. Ghost does not counter these cards. It doesn't do that. And so if it were an ongoing card, maybe it would be able to actually do its own job. But as is, if you're trying to deal with the Invisible Woman deck, 100% of the time, you'd rather be playing a Supergiant. Basically, every single time, you just be like, I'll go do Supergiant stuff instead. At 3/5, Ghost is maybe worth taking a punt on, but I've just never seen this card actually do its job in a meaningful way. It's like half-stepping, and I don't think going to 3/5 is going to meaningfully change that. Hydroman getting a point of power here is a nice thing to happen. Like, Hydroman's the kind of card that's been tooling around in like tier 3 stuff for a while. At 5/8, it was pretty clearly like just kind of tooling around in tier 3 stuff, but especially in a world where like Star-Lord and things of that nature exists, this is just like a pretty easy buff to make. I think it's a good buff. This is the kind of card that has some pretty clear counters, and I think if something like Hydroman and Pixie, spoiler alert, we're going to talk about her too, were like major forces in the metagame, they'd be much easier to deal with for the average player than Star-Lord. Like, if you look at Mobius and how it works against Mr. Negative, that's what it looks like when a tech card actually works against the things that are supposed to like be the things that it beats. And right now, I think that like largely where Ghost fails is that it's not nearly that good. It's not even like half of that good. It's like a quarter of that good. It's not even ongoing in one lane where Mobius is ongoing across the entire game. This is the card that I expect to, you know, maybe raise some potential Mobius play. There's going to be some interesting stuff here happening, but I think that this is the kind of card that needs buffs. Like, more cards like Hydroman should get stronger. Really, really important. Glad they're doing it. Don't think it's going to change much. Gamer's Pixie deck actually top 16 the Golden Gauntlet. It's a pretty solid deck already, and I think that a buff to Pixie, long overdue, is very reasonable at getting this deck to a point where like more people are seriously playing it. Pixie's just pretty good right now. Like, being a Pixie Magic deck is just a good position for you to be in a lot of the time. A lot of the things that are good about Mr. Negative are also good about Pixie. Now, there is a sort of question as to, like, if you're going to be a Pixie deck and you're going to play Magic, well, why would you not play Negative Star-Lord? And I think that is a valid question. I think it's very reasonable to be concerned with the fact that, like, you kind of are the second best in your own lane. But I do think Pixie going up to 2-3 is not necessarily long overdue, but I'm glad it happened. And I'm happy that Pixie is able to, get a reasonable stat line, considering that they've done so much in the Field of Energy cheat that makes her look pretty terrible. It definitely feels like it's about the time for her to be pretty closer to a vanilla stat line rate, given that her output, while cool, is not necessarily going to be all of that. Now, there is one other thing that Pixie does now have the potential to go into. I guess that would be Cerebro 3. Cerebro 3 can do kind of anything, but there is something to be said for, like, all right, I'm going to do Pixie Mobius in my Cerebro 3 and then just sort of have upside the entire rest of the game. That doesn't seem not compelling to me. Like, it does seem like the kind of thing that's like, there's usually just some flex slots in the deck, and it's like, all right, this is pretty interesting. It mixes up my output in a way that Cerebro 3 typically has no ability to, like, really confuse you about what their range is. Like, they're a very on board, like, here's what my range is kind of deck, and having Pixie Mobius in there I think actually does meaningfully change that. The other thing is, like, a lot of their 3s are just better than a lot of their 2s. So, like, even though you're only switching like 2s and 3s and 1s, you're just happy to reduce the power of the cost of basically any 3, and you'd be playing those cards anyway. So having something in here that does that, I know it doesn't seem like the most logical thing to do, but it does compel me. Like, I am pretty compelled by trying to do something like this. Let's talk about what this OTA didn't do, which is nerf Sholau, nerf Star-Lord, nerf Gambit, nerf whatever it is people are complaining about. To be honest with you, I would describe myself as cautiously optimistic and then deeply pessimistic, right? So let me explain. When I talk about the metagame as I see it right now, a lot of people are playing a lot of Gambit decks. Those Gambit decks are quite good against Sholau, and that's really good. It's really good that the new good card is not additive, but is instead pushing against Sholau. That's awesome. I love it. It creates a lot of space for decks like Ramp to show back up and start doing really well. That's dope. So right now, I would describe myself as cautiously optimistic on this, right? I am cautiously optimistic on the idea of there not needing to be a nerf to this stuff, because if there was one, I would have said it was probably to Sholau, and Sholau is definitely getting hammered by the Gambit stuff in a meaningful way that does matter, and they should let play out at least for a couple of weeks. Now, where am I deeply pessimistic? I am deeply pessimistic because when I analyze the Gambit decks, and then I'm like, okay, I'm looking at these Ramp decks, I'm looking at these Doom 2099 decks, I'm looking at the decks that beat the Gambit decks. There's a deck I kind of can't stop coming to as a deck that's probably really messed up, and that is Negative Star-Lord, because I feel like it's probably favored against all this stuff. Like, oh, the Sholau decks are getting hammered by Gambit? Cool, I'm playing Negative Star-Lord. Oh, they don't do anything to me. Oh, the game's over. Okay, nice deck, right? Like, that kind of thing is worrying for me. So while I am cautiously optimistic for the exact moment right now, I would describe myself as a little bit worried about, I look at the future and I'm seeing a lot of negative, I'm seeing a lot of Star-Lord. And maybe, that's fine. Maybe it's like reasonable, I'm going to play Mobius in my deck and it's chill, right? But I do think that we're getting to a point where the metagame is going to have a lot of polarized matchups in it. And people tend to really not like those metagames where it's like, well, I played Negative, they played Mobius, I'm gonna go. Like, that kind of stuff tends to be the kind of thing that people really don't enjoy dealing with. And I do think that, like, the way it started shaping up right now is, like, the Gambit decks are really good into the Sholau decks. The Sholau decks are really good into Ramp. Mr. Negative is really good at everything that doesn't have Mobius. And then you just sort of have this, like, rock, paper, not even rock, paper, scissors. It's not like you're playing rock, paper, scissors where, like, A beats B beats C. It's just like, do they have the thing that, like, totally turns my deck off, right? I think that, like, if people are going to complain about the upcoming metagame, it's largely going to be in those terms. And a lot of that, I think, lies at the feet of Gambit, who's like a very polarizing card in a way that I genuinely don't think we've had a card as polarizing as Gambit. Like, I think you could argue something like a Star-Lord is pretty polarizing, but Gambit is extremely polarizing in really obvious ways, which is to say, like, you go all in on Gambit, you beat everything doing small stuff, you instantly die when your opponent plays a 5/9, right? Like there's a lot of like there's polarized and then there's polarized, and Gambit is polarized. And so you have like a really interesting dynamic developing that I worry will degrade into a sea of my opponent had the counter, I have to retreat. And that's kind of not super compelling gameplay. So while I am cautiously optimistic for right now, I don't think it's like a huge mistake for them to be like, all right, Gambit's out and it's clearly doing something, right? Like the metagame is clearly open and clearly shifting in ways that were not true a week ago. I am sort of more long-term worried, which is to say, I think they get a pass on doing a patch that mostly doesn't change anything except for Pixie and maybe Sabah Nur and maybe seeding Debrii for the Ozymandias deck. But I don't know how long that pass lasts. I'm starting to have some future-leaning concerns here. As always, I've been KMBest, you've been phenomenal, and I will see you in the next one.